Hello, and welcome to week 6 of the summer 2025 database driven web development course. I'm Jim Kaufman with Rankin Technical College. Today's video is going to be about JOI, what's called JOI Validation Framework. And it's another node module that you'll be importing and using. First, I kind of want to talk about really why, what's important about validation, why do we use it, etc. Right? So, what is data validation? At its core, data validation is the process of ensuring that any input of incoming data aligns with predefined rules and expectations. Think of it as quality control step for using your application's data. Okay. So why is it important? So there's multiple reasons it's important. Basically, data integrity. It's your first line of defense against corrupted or incorrect data entering your system. So any users can enter any kind of data, unless you're doing some kind of validation and checking that data. Users and it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes it could be, intentional from a malicious standpoint, but it could also be just users do things, and we've all done it them ourselves. Supposed to put something in, we put something else in. Submitting images when we weren't, supposed to, or whatever. Choosing the wrong document, whatever. When you're, uploading something, so. Users make a lot of mistakes. We all as users make mistakes, and some users, do some really bizarre things, right? So you always it's very important to check your data. Never trust the data that's coming in. You always should check that. And especially nowadays with AI and other types of programs that could be running, that could be submitting data, not necessarily a human person doing it. So you always need to verify the data that's coming in is what you expect it to be. So here, once again, data integrity. It's your first line of defense against corrupt or incorrect data entering into your system. This keeps your application information clean and reliable. Okay. Security. Proper validation helps mitigate common vulnerabilities like SQL injection and cross-site scripting. And just real quick on what that is. So SQL, and these are important important topics that you should become familiar with. As a developer, you need to understand, the kinds of threats that could threats and vulnerabilities that could potentially cause a problem with your application. So in SQL, and the first one was SQL injection, and it's a vulnerability that allows attackers to interfere with the queries that an application makes to its database. And by injecting malicious SQL code into input fields, and this has happened before, okay? This does happen. That by actually formatting something into a HTML-like input field, you can actually do things that can access the database if you understand a little bit about the system and how the system's working, okay? So it can actually inject malicious SQL code into the input fields. Attackers can potentially access, modify, or delete sensitive data, or even take control of the entire database server. As far as cross-site scripting, it's also called CSS. Not CSS, XSS, sorry about that, is a type of security vulnerability found in web applications where malicious scripts are injected into trusted websites. These scripts are then executed by the user's browser when they visit the compromised site, potentially leading to data theft, session hijacking, and other malicious actions. Okay. So by sanitizing and checking the input, You make it much harder for malicious data to harm your application. User experience. So imagine filling out a form and getting cryptic errors. Good validation provides immediate helpful feedback to the users. So validation work will give those, immediate, useful error message back to the users so they can take action to correct things. And it's guiding them to correct their input and make the application easier to use. Application stability. Malformed data can lead to unexpected errors. Sometimes you could have a field that it's expecting numbers, but they're putting in other data, right? And we've done some of this with if-else statements, right? But there's much better ways to do it than just that. But basically, malformed data can lead to unexpected errors, crashes, and unpredictable behavior. Validation prevents these issues, making your application more stable and dependable. So the challenges of manual validation. So can I just use if-else statements to validate data? While this works for very simple cases, it quickly becomes a tangled mess as your application grows. Here are the common pitfalls for manual validation. Repetitive code, you kind of keep on writing the same code over again, just changing the names of the error messages and maybe some other things as well. But it's a lot, if-else statements. You can get a big long grouping of statements just to check some validation. Here, I'll just bring something up real quick here. So here's one for I have it commented out over here, but here's a bunch of if-else statements. So you're doing if the email's not there, email's missing, right? Password's missing. So it's very redundant. You're writing a lot of code, and sometimes you've got to, for our things, we're not going to be sending a lot of data for like this issue tracker, but when you get a more complex page where you might have 30, 40 fields, this is quite cumbersome and kind of really unnecessary if you use a framework. Okay. So repetitive code, error prone. It's easy to miss some edge case. It's difficult to maintain, and we're talking about manual validation here, and very time consuming. Okay, so them are the reasons. So there's this JOI framework. And this is where JOI comes in. JOI is a special JavaScript library that helps you define and check your data rules in a much easier way. And especially you can check in objects, matching a pattern you sent. There's all kinds of default behaviors available to you use. But it's like using a blueprint. It's like using a blueprint for your data. You create a schema, which is your blueprint, and then you give JOI some data to see if it fits the blueprint. Okay. JOI is great because it's easy to understand the rules. You write your rules in a clear, readable way. There's many built-in checks, like for numbers, text, emails, lists, etc. You just can say, hey, this is an email field, and it will use, the default thing to make sure does it have an @ sign. You don't have to tell it to check that. You just say, hey, this is an email. Check to see if this is a valid email, and it will do that. Now, you can also do some more complicated checking of emails where you can use regular expressions. Let's just say you work for a company, and that company obviously that company has a domain name, right? And so that domain name.com, and you can verify, hey, if it's in some internal application, are you using on internal email address, things like that, right? That's a little more complicated, but it will check just by default, does it have an @ sign? Does this look like a typical valid email address? So that's one of the built-in checks there. Clear error messages. If something's wrong, JOI gives you easy understanding messages about what the problem is. Can fix data types, it can even help convert data as well. So for JOI here, what you do is you do an import of JOI from JOI, just like we've done other imports. Then you create a schema. And as in this point, in this example, it's shown and this is a name that you give it, user schema. And this is how you have to format this, okay? As far as from this standpoint, you're going to give it your own name, whatever schema you want to give it. Then you have to do a JOI.object, okay? And then you want to include your different fields that you have coming in. So for this exercise, or for this lab, 0302 lab, most of this data will be coming in originally from Postman. Eventually we'll be not doing everything from Postman, and this stuff will be coming in from a web page that you have, right? So, but for now, we'll be using Postman for testing purposes and that. So for us right now, we're going to be thinking from a Postman perspective. So in this example, you've got 4 different fields you're sending in: username, email, age, hobbies. Okay, and for the username, it's saying expecting a username with a minimum of 3 and a max of 30, and it's saying, hey, this is required. Okay, and also I forgot to mention, you're stating this is a string. So username's a string, and in this case, it's saying I want my username to have a minimum of 3 characters, a maximum of 30 characters, and I want it to be required. And here's an example of an email where it's just saying, the email's a string, and it's saying email. This is a built-in data check for email, and it's saying it's required. So it must look like a valid email address, and it's stating it's required. Now here's one for age. Must be a number, a whole integer. Right here you've got number. Must be an integer, at least 18 so this is an age of 18 years old and a max of 120 years old. And obviously you don't have to have max, you could just have min. So it is optional on how you set that up. But the important one of this one is to see that you're doing something. The other two, you were using a string. This one, you're using a number, and saying the type of number is going to be integer. And here one, you can kind of notice we made these 2 required, and this one is, when this is saying optional, it means that it's not required. I should have meant the max. You can do just a min, or you can do a max. Min and max don't necessarily have to be together. You can say, I want this integer be a minimum of 18 and don't have a max at all, right? But when this said optional, I kind of misspoke on that. Basically, it's not required, right? So this one isn't stating it's required, okay? Here's hobbies. And hobbies, you're saying you're expecting an array of hobbies to come in, right? And you have different items, and you're saying each item is going to be a string. And here you have a default. Nothing's listed here, but you would put in your default values here of your hobbies as a potential default, okay? And you're not saying this one's required, so that means this field's basically optional. All right. So pretty much basically just went through this. So this is showing an example. Once you have your blueprint, here's an example. This is the schema that was just there. And here is an example of sending in good user data, where you've got a username. So all it's asking for the username is that you sent data. It's not checking anything. Well, it's checking for a minimum of 3, a max of 30, and it's required. So I apologize, I misspoke on that one. So a minimum of 3, a max of 30, and it's required. For the email address, just does this look like a valid email address? Yes. Then for the age, is it between 18 and 20? It is, 25. And here's hobbies of coding and reading. You're sending in an array of items. Each of them are strings. Okay, so that's a good user request. The next one here is a bad one, where you've got a username is too short. You're only sending in 2. Here's an email. This is not a valid email address. You don't have your @ sign, etc. And here's one you're sending in 15. It doesn't meet the requirements of the min and max for that. So that would be a bad one. Okay. And this is a function that will check the data for us. So you're basically using your user schema, and then you're passing in your data that you're receiving. And then this case, it's going to be the data that comes from within Postman. And like I said, eventually it's going to be coming in from a web page, right? So eventually at a point when we start using the React, we'll be creating the web page and we'll be sending the data in that way. Okay, I'm not going to go through this right now. All right, some common JOI rules you can use. So they have tons of different ones. You go out to the website here. I'll go ahead and put this link in the video at the bottom of the video, and you can look at that. Here's showing you some examples. Like here's kind of the same thing we were doing there. Here's a string where you got a password, and you're looking for, you want it a certain way, right? Letters and numbers. So you can have a alphanumeric characters, lowercase or uppercase, 0 through 9, 3 and 30. You're stating how, minimum and max on that, right? So this is just a regular expression, so you can do those as well. And this would be something you would do. This is showing a pattern for a password. And maybe for I don't know if it has email. So yeah, email here, it has something a little bit. It's allowing, in this case, it's only allowing .com or .net. But, if this is some internal, you're working in a company, you may be wanting to create that regular expression that's specific to your company. So you could be a certain .com or a certain .net, right? For most of the for us, for the most stuff, we're going to be doing some pretty basic validations, but it can be much more complex if needed. Okay, but this is the website, and you've got resources, policies, modules. There's a lot of things you can do. There's other modules you can bring in. Okay, for dates, address, etc. Formulas for math and string formula parser. Here's a little sandbox. You can play around and change things, right? And then you can validate it. So you come in here, play around with things, especially when you start doing some patterns. It becomes a little more complex. It's a good way to go ahead and validate some things. Okay. All right. So for text, for strings, as we already seen, we do a dot string. You have min length, max length required. You can check for email. You can check for URI, which must look like a web address. Now URI, if I know we've went over this in the HTML course. A URI is a universal resource identifier, as opposed to a URL, right? But a URL actually is a subset of URIs, mostly a superset. Because a URI, what I would call like the MongoDB string, that's not really a URL. A URL's like a website URL. We're familiar with that. A URI is a superset, and I really look at like a Mongo database string to access Mongo would fit more calling that a URI as opposed to a URL. So you can also trim. So if someone puts some spaces in there, they send in a username. It's supposed to be all one grouping of characters, and they put a space at the end. You can trim it. Leading and trailing spaces, you can trim it. For numbers, you check obviously if it's a number, if that number is a type integer, min value, max value. Check to see if it's a positive. And these are just a few. You can do others besides just an integer as well. There's lots of different options. For a list, you have to state that, hey, this is an array. And then for each item, what kind of items are there? And the case we were just looking at earlier in this document was string, but it could be a list of numbers as well. So you have to state what your items are that could be passed into your array. Are these strings? Are these numbers, etc.? Here you also have a min count. And you can also have Booleans. You can pass in a Boolean for a true or false Boolean. And also check to see if the dates are valid. Okay, so just to sum it up, this was just, quick little introduction to JOI. To sum it up, though, JOI is a fantastic tool because it's clear. You define the rules in a way that's easy for anyone to read and write and understand. It's comprehensive. It handles almost every data checking scenario you can think of. When something goes wrong, JOI tells you clearly what the issue is. It saves time when you write less code and you have fewer bugs compared to doing it all manually. Okay, so let's look real quick here at the lab assignment. So there's really not much for me to go over, like specifics when here, but basically this lab assignment is about using the JOI Validation Framework. And so it will point out in here where, like, so for certain instances, it's going to tell you for when you're getting your users list, your list of users, no changes are needed because you're not really doing anything but just pushing a button saying, give me the list, right? You're not really sending any data, right? This is just basically a URL call, right? This is just a call, your API call. Now, when you start passing in parameters, that's a little different, okay? You want to check if it's valid, okay? So here, for the register, you're going to create a schema with JOI and use it to validate all the things. You're sending all this in. So we want to validate all of this, right? We want to validate all this. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code here a little bit. Just an example that I have here. So here's a register. This was the quiz thing I'm working on. So this is a little different than what you guys were doing, but for most part, it's kind of the same scenario here. And, it's probably best case, best practice type thing is, keep your schemas together because you're going to have multiple of these. I'd kind of define them more towards up to the top of your thing after you get all your imports done. Spend some time making sure that, you kind of get all your imports together and then your schemas together instead of having them all over the place. Not that you can actually create, it's okay still, to create the schema before maybe the method itself if you want, right at the top of that, that's okay too. There's not really one way necessarily, but don't just have them, spread out all over where you don't know where it is. Either put all your schemas together somewhere at the top, or put it right before each individual function that's going to be using it. So in this case, defining a schema called register schema. So you want to give each one a unique name that's relevant to your function that you have. In this case, we're doing basically our fields were email, and so we're doing an email of required. It doesn't ask you in the lab to do a number, but in this case, I'm just enforcing a minimum. You can just, if you want, you can get rid of this altogether as far as from the lab's perspective, but I have mine as a minimum length of 6. And as you noticed, all of these are required. The email, and it states that in the lab, or at least the original lab. Let's just say, does it really mention that they're all required? No, it doesn't, but it did in earlier emails, right? That's why basically in our code, originally for our register code, we had, you were supposed to, hopefully you did do it, you did some validation checking. Hey, all of these, if it's not there, then you'd have an error message missing. So these are all required, right? Now I am okay with, if you want, you can pass in the full name, or you can construct the full name by adding the given name plus the family name together to create the full name. That's okay. Maybe sometimes people do put in middle names and so forth for their family name, or they may have, some people use the maiden name and their married name all part of their name. So I'm not concerned about that overall. Whatever you want to do on that, you can pass in the full name, or you can construct that using the family name and the given name. That's up to you on that. But back to what we were talking about, all of these were supposed to be required in earlier lab, so that's still the case. Okay. Back to our schema here. Basically, all of these are just required. The only thing besides just basic validation that's kind of part of the default package here for the JOI is here we go ahead and do a validate on the role. And in your case, so for me, I've got admin, student, instructor. For this lab, for these labs though, you have your other ones, right? You have developer, whatever. And also watch what you're doing here on this. You can change this to ignore case or whatever, or that's up to you. And also from a perspective of saving this to the database as well. I think it's best to try to always, even if someone submits a uppercase, just make it all lowercase, put it in the database in a lowercase, and then you can always check from a lowercase perspective. Okay. But for yours was like developer, system analyst, or a business analyst, etc. Right? Them are the ones you're going to want to enter. So all your different valid ones that you possibly need to enter, you put that here. Okay. But like mine, for the thing I'm creating, I have some different roles. So make sure you include the correct roles for the issue tracker. All right, so there's my schema for this one. And then I'm going to come down here to the register. And, well, first, just want to mention, you got to make sure that you go ahead and install JOI and do your import, your ESM import. And basically what you'll do in this situation is you're going to create, call this what you want. We're doing validate result, and we're taking our register schema. So obviously, if you don't have JOI installed, If you have included the module and imported it, then this would not work right here, right? So register schema is what you called it up here. Register schema. And then you want to go ahead and validate, and then you can pass in the whole request body. Okay. This I was just putting a couple debug statements here for testing purposes, but that's not necessary. Okay. So basically here I'm saying if my validation result, if there's an error, then go ahead and return that error. Okay. So basically us creating that schema, doing this, replaces all of these statements. So you're not going to have, you don't need to do all these statements now. Okay. All you need to do is pass in your body into this validate function of your register schema, and you will get a validation result. Either it'll be a passing one or it'll be an error. Okay. And basically, if any of them fail, then you're going to have an error, right? So let me go ahead and pull up Postman here. Okay. Yep. So I started my server here. And I am doing, and this is up to you what you want to do, but I did go ahead and create some debugging statements, so you just kind of see how it prints things out. It's kind of beneficial to help you a little bit. You may not want to leave all this stuff in here all the time because it could become kind of very verbose and return a lot of stuff. But so let me bring this up in Postman. So here on this one, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just not have an email at all here. And actually, let me see if I can go ahead and include both of these together here. So we can see this a little better. So the first one I'm doing here, well, for our schema, it's required. Let's see all of our required ones here. So most all of them, well, all of them are required, right? Not almost. All of them are required. And so email, I don't have anything marked as required here. I hit send. And here comes back an error. And it's basically telling you email is not allowed to be empty. Okay. So this will do one at a time. There is a way to do it for multiple, but for the most part, this is going to tell you one at a time. So then if you go ahead and put your email address back in there. And so for our password, I had a minimum of a 6. So I'm passing it a 5 there. So I got my email address back in there, so you shouldn't fail on that one. All right, so this is showing you your original data, and then here's your details, and it's giving you a message. Password length must be at least 6 characters. Okay. So for Postman, you bring this all back. When we have the web, though, we can parse this, right? We can parse just the message, so we're not sending all, the user would not see all this, right? You don't want users seeing all this. They're especially users that are not technical. They're not going to understand what that means anyhow. They might figure it out a little bit, but it's a little confusing, right? You would just parse this back to the web just to have the message, right? And you may not even do it like that either, but okay. We don't have to get into too much of that. So basically same thing on all of this. Let's see, role. So my role here, even if I fix that one, my role all these others are going to be fine. Obviously, if you got the data, they're going to work. I do have full name here and given, but I do have a role of user where I've got that. I don't have the user in here. So I click this here on that one, and it's going to tell you probably, I guess you can see a little bit here. The picture's probably in the right. The role must be one of these, and it isn't because it's a user, right? And then obviously if I went ahead and changed this one to admin, hit send, boom. New user registered, user ID. So that one passed all the validation and went ahead and registered the new user. So very, very handy tool, very good framework to use, very popular framework to use. And like I said, I'll go ahead and add the link to the JOI link to the JOI documentation, and pretty straightforward here, I think. As compared to other things you worked on, I don't see being a big problem. But please let me know if you have any problems with this. And I guess that's all I have for today. And take care, and I'll talk to you next time. See ya.